Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of the Tom's Hardware Show. We normally go live Thursdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, but we just got some big news from Nvidia this afternoon, and we just couldn't wait to get into it. So we are going live now. That's right. We are live right now, September 1st, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And just like any episode of the Tom's Hardware Show, we are taking viewer questions. So if you have something to ask, just put your question into your Facebook or YouTube chat, and we'll be looking to answer those by the end of the show. So RTX 3000, aka Ampere, has officially been unveiled. So we have a couple of Tom's Hardware editors joining me today to dive into it all. We have Matt Safford, Tom's Hardware Managing Editor. And we also have Jared Walton, our Senior Editor, covering all things graphics.
Howdy, Sharon.
Hello. I want to start with you, Jared, since this is your beat. For those of us who maybe didn't have 2 hours to hang out with Nvidia this afternoon, can you give us a brief overview of what we learned about Ampere today?
I mean, so the big news obviously is it's going to be potent. I mean, like this is a big jump. They've gone from, well, so fundamentally your GPUs are highly parallel processors. There's a lot of graphics calculations that is like you can just farm them out to thousands of separate threads, if you want to call it that. It's not like a CPU thread, but whatever. And they all run in parallel, and there's a lot of things to do because you've got, millions of pixels on a screen that you can sit there and try and render. So if you have 1,000 cores or 10,000 cores, it's all good. You can split it up. So for example, the RTX 2080 Ti, the previous Halo card, if you want to call it that, it has 68 streaming multiprocessors, SMs. That's kind of your equivalent of a CPU core, if you want to call that. Each of those has 64 CUDA cores, and so all told, it ends up with 4,352 CUDA cores. So that's 4,000. That's a lot. The RTX 3090 will have 10,496 CUDA cores. So more than double. That's, I mean, like, it's huge. And we don't know all the architectural details, but one of the things we suspect is they are doubling the number of CUDA cores per SM, which there's reasons to go smaller, reasons to go larger. Kepler had, I think, 192. Maxwell and Pascal went to 128. Then Turing went to 64, and now it looks like Ampere on the consumer side is going back to 128. That's my guess anyway. Anyways, the CUDA cores, you multiply the number of CUDA cores times 2 because you're doing fused multiply add operations, and then you times it by the clock speed, and that gives you your teraflops. And so the 2080 Ti was a roughly 14.2 teraflop chip. The 3080, not the 3090, the 3080 is basically a 30 teraflop chip. The 3070 is going to be a 20 teraflop chip, and the 3090 is going to be nearly 36 teraflops. So this is a huge boost in computational power. Ray tracing is 1.7 times faster per ray tracing core, they said. And your tensor cores are 4 times faster, but half as many per SM, something like that. Anyway, it's a computational monster, and they're saying the 3070 will be faster than a 2080 Ti. The 3080, Jensen said, is twice as fast as a 2080, and the 3090, I don't know that he gave hard numbers, but I would expect the 3090 to be screaming fast, and also it's screaming expensive. The pricing, not so bad as I worried. Like $1,500 is insane, right, for just a graphics card.
That's for the 3090, right?
Yeah, that's the 3090. That's the low end of what I expected, because we said it's going to be a big chip. It's going to be really powerful. It's basically the replacement for the Titan, it looked like, and sure enough, it's a Titan price, but it's not the $2,500 Titan RTX. It's the $1,500 Titan called an RTX 3090. So that's not as bad as it could have been. That's $300 more than the 2080 Ti, and hopefully twice as fast. So that's anyone who is thinking about NVLink SLI 2080 Ti's is probably like, praising that they didn't waste the money on that right now and they can buy a 3090. And if you already have 2080 Ti SLI, now's the time to sell them and buy a 3090. But I think most of us are really interested in the 3070 and the 3080 because those are $500 and $700, basically carrying the 2080 Super and 2070 Super prices forward. So that was at least somewhat pleasant news. It's not like cheap, but it's not as astronomical pricing as it could have been.
Well, that's a nice way to look at things. Very positive outlook. Matt, what did you think seeing this announcement?
I mean, I was just going to say, I also think that the pricing seems good in part because the previous generation launch was so expensive, and that they're adding apparently this much performance without raising the prices dramatically. Especially given that they don't have really any competition in the high end, is kind of shocking.
Well, so you say they don't have competition, but that's part of the big question, right? Big Navi is coming. We assume all indications are Big Navi will have up to 80 compute units. Their compute units don't have double the shader cores though, so we don't know exactly how performance is going to shake out, but Nvidia said their Ampere chips are 1.9 times the performance per watt as Turing, and they went to 320 watts on the 3080, 350 watts on the 3090, but the 3070 is only 220 watts, so that's not so bad. But I mean, AMD's saying 1.5 times or 50% increase for performance per watt for their Big Navi versus their current Navi 1X cards. So, if it all pans out, we could actually see at least competitive AMD performance. I don't think they're going to touch the 3090, but maybe they can come close to 3080 and 3070. We'll have to run the tests and find out. But the question is, can they do it and actually undercut or at least keep close to NVIDIA pricing? I don't know.
Yeah, or will they launch a card that
will it be Fury Part 3? The R9 Fury X, disappointed. Vega 64, disappointed. Radeon 7, disappointed. So they're on a roll. I hope it actually ends up really competitive, but fingers crossed.
Absolutely.
So we have a couple of questions from viewers, which is great. Please keep them coming. I don't know if we actually know the answers to these, but let's see. We have one question from Armin asking if we know about, they're ambitious. They want to use two 3090s already.
They want $3,000 of graphics cards. So here's the thing. I assume they might have NVLink again, but gosh, if you're running two graphics cards in 2020, you're probably realizing how bad it is on so many games. I'm trying to think, in the last year, how many games have actually supported multi-GPU SLI stuff that came out? I can tell you Flight Simulator doesn't. I can tell you Project Cars doesn't. I can tell you Doom Eternal doesn't. I can list all sorts of games that do not support SLI at all, and I don't think it's going to get better. There will be a few things that do. If you're trying to set benchmark records in 3D Mark and you want to use SLI for that, I guess that's kind of the best case scenario. There are games like Hitman 2 supports SLI or multi-GPU. And, I think Rise of the Tomb Raider did. Shadow of the Tomb Raider did not, unless, I don't know. The hard thing about multi-GPU is so far to date, none of the games that support ray tracing have supported multi-GPU with ray tracing, which is kind of I don't know if there's some technical limitations that make it too hard to do, but that would be your best case scenario. It's hey, take Control and run it at 4K with all the ray tracing effects and still get 70-80 frames per second. That would be lovely. But
go back to the physics days and get your dedicated card.
The 3090 for physics. There you go. Hey, what is it? Batman Arkham Knights is coming out. Maybe they'll do physics again. That's been one of the series that did a lot of physics stuff. Anyway, they did not say SLI or NVLink And given that, like they cut down from 3 and 4-way SLI to basically 2-way SLI with Pascal. There was a possibility to try and do 3 or 4-way, but it required a bunch of extra effort and wasn't really worth it. And then Turing totally killed off anything more than 2-way, and it was only available on the 2070 Super and above. So 2070 Super, 2080, 2080 Ti, 2080 Super, I think I missed too. So I won't be surprised if it's something where even if they support it, they're going to restrict it and just say it's only on the 3090 or only on the 3090 and maybe 3080. But
I think looking at our announcement story, it looks like 3090 is the only one that will support SLI. So
isn't that the one that would need it the least, though?
well,
we always say,
sure, but for compute,
I've always said if you're going to do multi-GPU, like you should at least get the fastest GPU you can before you move to multi-GPU. Like if you had a 2080, you'd be better off moving to a 2080 Ti. Even with the 50% jump in pricing, you were better off getting a 2080 Ti than buying two 2080s. Because at least the 2080 Ti was always faster, whereas two 2080s, it's like, hey, 80% of the games, it does nothing.
Well, speaking of, go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say that my major issue with SLI has always been like, there will always be like one game that'll crop up that actually performs worse, and you have to disable the card or take it out. Yeah, yes. Well, I mean, like something you're trying to play, and it's like, why is this so bad? Oh, I have to disable a graphics card.
Yeah, I did throw in two cards, two 2080 Ti's for Microsoft Flight Simulator just to see what it would do. Performance dropped like 5 to 10%. Partly that might have been because, I'm on a Z390 platform, but you can only do X8 PCI Express links when you're doing two GPUs. And so that may have been a factor. That might have dropped the performance slightly, or it might have just been like the driver doing extra work. I don't know, but it certainly didn't use the second GPU and it dropped performance a bit. So, and that's been increasingly common over the past couple of years.
Yeah, there's nothing like paying several hundreds of dollars, if not more, only to get worse performance. Especially if it happens to be like the game that you're dying, to play.
But how fast can you do cryptocurrency mining?
We all want to know.
3D Mark scores will be amazing.
Yeah.
So what do you guys think? Pantera is wondering if they should start thinking about buying, I guess, a RTX 3080 or maybe any of the cards, or will there be Super or Ti versions of them? Should we just wait it out a little?
No, I don't think the Super or Ti or whatever are going to launch that soon. I do think you'll see like an in-between card. There's a big gap between like the 3070 to the 3080 and then the 3080 to the 3090. I don't know when NVIDIA is going to fill that gap. It might be in 2 months when AMD launches their competing cards. It really depends on how competitive AMD is, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see, a spring refresh where you get like 5% better performance for the same price. And I'm like, waiting 6 months for 5% more performance is not that important to me. I know, like, if you bought a if you bought the 1660 Ti right when it came out, and then the 1660 Super came out 5 months later and offered similar performance for $50 less, maybe that was enough to get upset about, but I don't know. I figure you buy it because you want it, not because you need it for most of us.
Yeah, no, the upset people are the ones who bought the 2080 Super or 2080 Ti in the last few months. Those really upset people.
Well, I wrote that article like 2 or 3 months ago saying it's a terrible time to buy a graphics card. Just don't do it, because we knew these cards were coming, and I'm like, even if they were less than they ended up being, like, it's still worth waiting to see, rather than, like, if you wanted a 2080 Ti, your best time to buy it was right at launch. Pay the $1,200 and have it for 2 years as the best, fastest graphics card. Waiting until it's 18 months old and then buying it, it's like, well, now something new is just around the corner. That's not good.
Hey, Jared, can I borrow $1,500? Like now?
Yeah. Talk to my boss. He can give you a loan.
So let's talk design a little, because we have a question regarding the fans facing different directions, as Rashid points out. Any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure if they're facing. I think they both pull in. From the illustration, they both pull in air from the bottom. The one that's closer to the IO ports shoots it out the back of your PC. The other one shoots it through the radiator. So, the direct flow through the radiator, it's kind of like what you get on most CPU coolers. And I think that will cool a lot better and hopefully generate less noise. And obviously, Nvidia went big on the power. So 350 watt for the 3090, 320 watt for the 3080. Cooling that effectively is difficult, and it requires some design considerations. I've said this in one of the articles too. I'm like, man, in retrospect, the 20 series Founders editions, those cards look nice, but the back plates, especially on like the 2080 Super and 2080 Ti, they get hot. Like if I pull out an IR thermometer and point it at a 2080 Ti running stock Founders edition, the back plate is like 75 to 80 C. Even if you crank up the fan speed, it still stays at like 70 C. And it's like the GPU itself isn't really any cooler than that, and you're like, or any hotter than that. And it's like, man, all the heat is like ending up on the back plate. And I think having their new design will keep it so that the card itself doesn't get scorching hot on the outside. Because if you played a game and for whatever reason shut off your computer and grabbed your graphics card, I've done that because I test graphics cards, right? You're like, okay, I'm finished benchmarking, I'm going to swap GPUs, and you grab that card and it's like, oh dang, that's hot. And so then I like turn the computer back on, let it sit for a couple of minutes, shut off, and then remove the card because I don't want to burn my fingers. So I think the new cooling will definitely help in that aspect. But Asus, Gigabyte, MSI, whoever, all these other companies, it looks like many of them are going to have traditional designs that look just like their previous generation cards. So
just bigger.
Yeah. I mean, like the triple slot thing is going to be a real deal on a lot of the 3080 and 3090 cards.
Or 2.9 or 2.7.
Yeah. Yep.
Thin slices of slots.
I had a Zotac Amp Extreme. I think it was a 1080 Ti. I can't remember which model, but that was like a 2.7 slot thing. Just huge, massive, beefy, cool. But it ran cool. Like compared to the reference model, it was like 10 to 15 C cooler and super quiet because it's like, well, yeah, when you have a heatsink that's like this thick, you don't need a lot of fan speed.
So speaking of third-party cards, and I'm not sure how much, I know I saw a couple announcements today. I don't know how many we've already seen in terms of third-party cards. But one question we have is, how much room do you think there is for third-party cards to overclock and add performance that way? Anyone?
I mean, we don't know because we haven't tested the cards ourselves.
Right.
I mean, like, one thing to know about NVIDIA is they list they didn't even list base clocks now. They've kind of gotten away from base clock. They list their boost clock. And on the RTX, well, actually, it's pretty much on all of NVIDIA's GPUs since Pascal for sure, probably even Maxwell before that. They would list a boost clock that was a conservative boost clock. So it's like they would say, hey, your 2080 Ti can boost up to 1545 megahertz. But then you'd open up like a MSI Afterburner or GPU-Z or something that tracked GPU clock speed, and you're like, man, I'm getting 1800 megahertz. I'm like way above boost. And they do that intentionally because people are really excited to see a card overperform rather than underperform. AMD traditionally went the other route where they would say, hey, the maximum boost clock is 1.3 gigahertz, and you'd look at the card and it would often run at like 1.2 or whatever. They kind of changed that with the Navi generation, so the RX 5700 series, where now their gamer clock is more of a conservative boost. So they'll say, hey, it typically runs at 1700 megahertz and you might get 1750. But NVIDIA has said 1700 megahertz on the 3090, 1710 on the 3080, and 1730 on the 3070. It's also Samsung's 8 nanometer process, which was a bit of a surprise. It's not TSMC. Probably TSMC is just kind of tapped out. So many people are using it, including Apple, Nvidia, AMD, even Intel, that they went to Samsung and maybe got a better price to boot. But we don't know exactly how well Samsung 8 nanometer is going to perform relative to other GPUs. So when they say 1700 megahertz, it's like, well, is it still going to boost up to like 1.9, maybe even 2 gigahertz or more? Hopefully, but we just have to wait and see until we actually get cards in hand. And then that will tell us, what headroom there is for third-party overclocking. Usually these days, I expect no more than 10% overclocks on GPUs, and that's even if you put on a big monster cooler. I guess Navi was a little better if you overrode some of the power limitations. You could get it to go higher, but
So
Nvidia not so much.
we've been seeing recently a lot of small form factor pre-builds coming out, and we actually have a question asking if we think this card would work with a small form factor build, assuming you can get it to fit. Is the heat going to be a problem?
Well, which card? The 3090?
GJJ123456 specifically asked about the 3080.
Oh, the 3080s, I think the 3080 is going to be pretty similar in size to like a 2080 Ti. I mean, 2080 Ti and 2080 are basically the same size card. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's going to be substantially larger. There is that concern of like venting air into the case.
Right.
But TDP is like 100 watts higher, more, right?
Yep.
Yeah. I think that's going to be the bigger issue. Even if you could get it to fit, and somebody Zotac or somebody makes a small card, what's it going to sound like?
Yeah.
And how hot is it going to be after like 4 hours of gaming?
Oh, but they're so cute. I miss Matt's small form factor build. I used to sit next to me in the office.
I tell you what, I'm all about the bigger PC because I swap GPUs way too often. I mean, literally, it's a daily thing. And I had a smaller form factor system at one point, and actually, that's how I got started. If you guys didn't know, I did small form factor reviews for Anon Tech. Don't go look them up, please. No, but I cut lots of knuckles and fingers trying to work in those dang cramped cases, and I came to kind of loathe them a little bit. So when I shifted over to big desktops, I was like, oh yeah, this is great. But yeah, I think I had someone from a system integrator actually tell me, and this was several years ago, but he's like, he refused to use anything but blower cards in small form factors because when you had the open air coolers venting into the case, if you had a mini ITX case, it was just a recipe for disaster. And he's like, I don't want customers coming back and complaining and saying, hey, my system's unstable. And so he only used blowers, which I think they even got like Asus to do a custom, I mean, not custom, but they did a blower card for the 2080 Ti. And that was pretty much for system integrators that wanted to do smaller builds where they wanted to vent the heat. But yeah, those, I don't know. I would say probably you want a bigger mini ITX or at least a micro ATX if you're going to try and stuff in a 3080. That's the safe bet.
Yeah, I think 3070 will be probably about as high as it's going to go. Really
3070 is the sensible choice anyway, right? It's a 2080 Ti performance. Actually, they said better than 2080 Ti for $500. I mean,
that's
finally.
Interesting. This is, of course, not an official sample size, but I was noticing a lot of our comments are asking about the 3080 and the 3090 and not the 3070.
That's not coming until October. I mean, that's a month out. So I don't know.
People get excited about the top end things and new levels of performance. That's where a lot of the excitement is, but I'm sure that Nvidia will sell many more 3070s.
Yeah, long term they'll probably sell like 5 to 10 times as many 3070s as 3090s. It is interesting. Jensen said something about like they created the Titan cards as sort of like the Uber card that it wasn't sensible. It wasn't really necessary. It wasn't even that much faster. I mean, we've tested the Titan cards, and it's like relative to the next step down, the 2080 Ti or 1080 Ti or 780 Ti or whatever it was always like 3 to 5% faster, and it's like, oh yeah, you doubled your VRAM, but usually that didn't matter, and the price more than doubled often. And so it was kind of this thing where it's like a status symbol or whatever. And Jensen said something like, we sold way more Titan cards than we really thought we would. And so now, instead of the Titan RTX version whatever 2, they're doing an RTX 3090, and it's only $1,500 instead of being $2,500. And it's like, oh, they're so generous, so nice. Not really, but they'll sell more at $1,500 than they sold at $2,500, I'm sure.
Sure.
So we do have a couple people asking about CPU recommendations. We have Tyler asking specifically about 3080 and 4K performance. Are we able to start thinking about that yet? Do we have enough information?
Yeah, if you look back, if you search on Tom's Hardware, you'll find I did an article just a couple months ago, and it was specifically in preparation for this, where I benchmarked a 9900K against a 3900X just to see how they compared across all resolutions. And I did it with multiple GPUs. I think I used 10 different GPUs, and they went from 2080 Ti down to a 2060, and then the 5700 XT down to the 5600 XT, something like that. Anyway, I did all the testing, and it's like, yeah, actually your CPU still matters at 1080p and 1440p on the higher end cards. At 4K, the gap started to narrow down to like 3 to 5%. But now we're talking about a GPU, which, I mean, we don't know exactly, but possibly it's 50% faster than the 2080 Ti. So that just pushed the CPU bottleneck hard. And so even at 4K, we're now potentially hitting situations where your CPU is going to matter more. So if you're willing to buy a $1,500 graphics card on a 3090, I think the only sensible choice right now is you'd have to go with a 10900K or at least a 10850K and overclock it, because those are still 5 to 10% faster than the 9900K that I use for testing, and the fastest Ryzen chip right now, the 3900X, it's actually faster than the 3950 in gaming. It's like anywhere from 5% slower at 4K to maybe 15% slower at 1080p. And so I'd say if you are worried about CPU, either get a 10900K or wait for Zen 3 and see what that does.
What if you don't require 4K? What if you just want to do 1080p?
Then don't buy the 3090. I mean,
right. Well, what would you recommend?
Well, you need a 360 hertz monitor to pair with it if you're going to do that.
There you go. I mean, the only thing that 360 hertz monitors are good for is like CSGO and League of Legends. Like, if you play Flight Simulator, it didn't matter what GPU you had or what CPU. Like, your best case scenario at minimum quality was like 180 frames per second. Not that you would need it for a simulator, but whatever. If you're playing at 1080p with ray tracing and all the bells and whistles, like, conceivably the 3080 might still be GPU limited, but I think 1440p is kind of more where I would see the 3080 being necessary. And that's like my favorite gaming resolution right now, because 4K monitors, like, it's hard to get a higher refresh rate on them without spending a ton of money. And I'm older, so like when I'm working outside of a game, like in Windows, if I load up Word or a website, I'm often sitting there going, okay, my 4K monitor needs to be at 150% scaling because I can't read it comfortably from 4 feet away. Whereas like a 1440p, I'm like, no, that looks much better. I'm jealous of Matt. I think, don't you have like a 42-inch 4K?
49.
49. See,
It's a TV. I'm looking at it right now. That's how I'm older too, and that's how I deal with scaling, is just make the screen bigger.
Yeah, so I've got a 28-inch 4K that I'm using right now, and there's more 28-inch 4Ks behind me because I have multiple test beds, and every one of them, it's like if I'm trying to read just text at 100% DPI, I'm just like sitting there going, oh, what does that say? And it's painful, so I can't even imagine.
Glasses. If you're
Old.
older.
Old. I've got glasses. They don't help for like this distance.
Oh,
And when I'm reading like a book, they make it worse. Don't talk to me about bifocals.
okay, I want to talk to you actually about monitors. You know, I love monitors, and I did cover some. We already knew about a bunch of 360 hertz monitors. We basically got a little bit more info on some of them, but there are like a handful coming out this fall. Like you said, you pretty much are limited to esports titles. But I'm wondering, with these new graphics cards, can I maybe up the settings from the lowest settings and still hit over 300 FPS with these
I
better?
mean, it depends on the game, right? Because when you increase the settings, and I actually tested Flight Simulator and Project Cars 3 during the past 2 weeks, and both of those are simulators, and they had similar situations where increasing your settings didn't actually make the game less of a CPU bottleneck up until ultra quality. So it was like at 1080p low settings, you were maybe limited to 200 frames per second. If you drop to 1080p medium, or sorry, if you increase to 1080p medium, your frame rates would drop to 180 frames per second, but you were still CPU limited. So like the 2070 Super and the 2080 Ti performed the same within like a few percent of each other. And it was only at like 1440p Ultra that you started to see the usual like 20% delta between a 2070 Super and a 2080 Ti. So when you increase the complexity, the graphics settings, that often means more CPU work as well, because it's doing more geometry calls, more draw calls, which requires more CPU performance. And so it's like, yeah, your CPU can only render or deal with so much data per second. And so if you double the amount of data that a frame requires, then you cut your frame rate in half, even if you're purely CPU limited and you have all the GPU in the world. And so I think that's what you'll see on a lot of games where they are actually close to CPU limited already with like your 2080 Ti, 2080 stuff, and the 3080 won't help them. But there are going to be other games where, like, honestly, this is one of those where it's down to optimizations and the developers. So a really good DirectX 12 or Vulkan implementation that scales with more threads and more cores, like you can see high performance on those. I think Doom Eternal was a great example of that, where if you ran at 1080p and lower settings, like you would get up into the 200, 300 frames per second, whereas Assassin's Creed is a terrible game for scaling or for high frame rates and high refresh rates.
Exciting. I love when I get over 300, like 302, 310 in a loading screen or menu.
Yeah, and then the real problem is you get those games that still come with a frame rate cap, or they're like, oh, no one needs more than 120 frames per second, right?
Not no one.
But there are games that have done that, right? And it's thankfully they're becoming less common, but you still see a lot of games where they don't fully unlock the frame rate because they tie physics or something weird with the frame rate, and then it causes problems. What about 8K? Are you excited for 8K?
You read my mind, Jared. I was going to ask you, talk to me about 8K. I mean, I don't know what I would do with 8K right now, how I'm going to leverage that. So is there something with the 4K games that could take me to 8K, perhaps, like DLSS?
Yeah, exactly. So 4K on, like, let's say a 3080, if it's 30% faster than a 2080 Ti or 50% faster, like that makes 4K gaming absolutely viable at native resolution. But then 8K is 4 times as many pixels, and that's just not going to happen at 60 frames per second, certainly. And so you do DLSS, and it's like, oh, a 3090 or a 3080 with DLSS upscaling from 4K to 8K should actually perform pretty well. I'm going to have to talk to my manager, Matt, and see if he can get me one of those 8K displays for benchmarking purposes, because they only cost like, what, $3,000, $4,000?
Hey, Jared, can I borrow $3,000 to $4,000?
I actually want I think Andrew linked it to me. He's like, oh, this is what I need. And it's an 88-inch LG, I think it's OLED, but it was an 8K 88-inch TV. And I'm like, yeah, that is what I need for benchmarking. Like, I'm just going to expense that.
I mean,
it was $30,000. I forgot that part.
Hey, Jared. No.
Can I borrow your salary for a year?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that they're pushing 8K because they have to go somewhere, right? But yeah, like those displays don't really exist in large number, and like I think there are more TVs than there are monitors. But I mean, if you're gonna actually run at 8K, in order to even hope to actually see the difference, you're gonna need to be running on a very big screen, or literally sitting like 6 inches in front of it. In which case, it would be like gaming on an IMAX screen. So.
Yeah, I actually remember seeing the first 8K displays at CES. What was it like? It might have been 3 years ago, 4 years ago, whenever it was. The first 8K displays, and they had like an 80-inch or whatever display, and like I walked up with my eyes and sat a foot away from the TV and looked at it, and I'm like, I literally can't see the individual pixels. Like that's how big 8K is. It's like on a several feet wide or 8 foot wide display, I still couldn't see pixels. And I don't have great eyesight. Like I'm not like Mr. Superman vision, but I don't have terrible eyesight either. And I'm like, yeah, if I get really close to my 4K display, it's kind of the same thing right now. It's hard to see the individual pixels. So I'm like, if you're sitting on your couch, I would have a hard time telling the difference between a really high quality 1080p and a 4K and certainly 8K from 10 feet, 15 feet away on a 65-inch TV. There's people that they say they see the difference, and I'm like, I think what you're really seeing is a difference in encoding quality. Because if you have a crappy 1080p encode, then yeah, it looks a lot worse than a good or decent 4K encode. But I think if you had equal quality levels on all three, that your visual system isn't such that you can actually resolve the finer details at 10 to 15 feet away when you're sitting on a couch.
Yeah, I just would like to point out that I remember probably 2004 when like we first started seeing like 24-inch monitors. Like I had a 21-inch CRT, but like when 24-inch monitors started becoming semi-affordable, like in the $600-700 range, there was a lot of discussion of like, is a 24-inch monitor going to cause motion sickness when people game because they'll have to move their head so much? 24 inches, which is now.
So I was like you. I had a 21-inch CRT up until about 2004, and I saw the Dell. What was it called? Is like the 2400. I can't remember the model number, but anyway, it was their first 24-inch monitor, and I saw that. I'm like, I have to have that. And I paid $600 for my 21-inch CRT back in '96 or something. So I bought one, and man, I was like, I'm never going back to CRT. Like the flat screen and the perfect geometry. I'm like, I'm done with analog signals. So yeah, that was huge. But
that same monitor, but I got a better deal because I pretended I was a small business owner.
I paid $1,000, and then I got like a 30-inch monitor a few years later for review that I just kept using, and then eventually I moved to 4K, and I actually was sad to let the 30-inch go because 2560 by 1600 at 30-inch was more comfortable to use than 4K at 28-inch. But for testing purposes, I needed to do 4K. So, I mean, this 8K business, I'm like, I don't know when I'm going to need 8K.
Yeah, and I don't know when I'll have. Like Matt said, like to get like a really big screen where you can really enjoy, that sharp resolution. I literally don't have a big enough apartment. Like I can get a bigger screen, but I'll be so close to it that it wouldn't be comfortable. And we actually have a question asking, when do we think 8K TVs will get more approachable for the average person? Like for me, it just won't be because I don't have a big enough space. So
well, I mean, like, remember when 4K TVs first came out? Like, what did they cost? They were thousands of dollars, right? And we bought a 4K 65-inch TV this past Christmas for $300, and it's like, wow.
You could barely even find a HD one anymore.
Yeah, and so I'm like, I think the feeding it an 8K signal at a reasonable rate is going to be harder, but if you're just upscaling it, I'm like, I could see it not costing that much more to make an 8K TV, so it might only be a few years before all of a sudden it's like, hey, get your 8K 80-inch TV for $600.
Yeah, I mean, I think once they start making them, I mean, I guess this isn't going to drive they're not going to sell enough 3090s to drive,
No.
the panel companies to adopt, but content, when the content exists and they start mass producing them, like they'll get pretty cheap pretty fast as they did with 4K. But I would say probably not next year, but the year after.
I don't want to stream 8K video right now because I'm on freaking Xfinity with a 1.2 terabyte data cap, and I'm like, every time I see like a 4K stream on Amazon Prime or Netflix or whatever, I'm like going, how much data is that using for every hour I watch? And then you kind of look at it and you're like, we just used like 50 gigabytes of data to watch that movie. If we did this too often, like my kids could easily blow through my data cap. And then it's like, well, why don't you just pay $50 more a month for an unlimited data cap?
And there's so many people working from home right now. Like the infrastructure can't handle shit to 8K right now. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm already seeing like actors' pores and stuff in 4K. I don't know if we need to go deeper.
TMI, don't want to see your zits.
So we have another viewer question regarding the RTX 3000 cards, Ampere in general. They'd like to know if it would be reprehensible if they used it with PCIe 3.
Like right now, you can pair an Ampere card with Zen 2 and get your PCI Express Gen 4, but I will wager, and I'm going to test this later this month, I'm going to test it on the 3900X and see what performance looks like, and I will bet you money that the 9900K, never mind the 10900K, will beat the 3900X across the board, even though it has the slower interface. And the reason is the interface becomes less important the more memory that your graphics card has. So like the one card that we've seen an X8 versus an X16 difference on Gen 4 is the 5500 XT 4 gigabyte card, because it has to pull more data over the PCI Express bus. And so if you stick it in a PCI Gen 3, it gets half the bandwidth and it slows it down a little bit. So I think if you're worried about PCI Gen 4, it's not going to be that big of a deal. Like it might become more useful down the road, but I don't think we're at the stage yet where it's necessary for what the graphics cards are doing.
All that being said, when I was looking at the announcement today, and you have Samsung 8 nanometer and PCI 4, it's like that doesn't look great for Intel right now.
Yeah, I mean, like Intel is really, they blew it on 10 nanometer. Like it's not like something they intentionally did, right? But they had some serious engineering missteps there that caused them serious grief, and they're only now kind of just getting out of it because, like, let's be real, they still don't have more than a 4-core chip on 10 nanometer, super fin, whatever you want to call it. Like even the new Tiger Lake stuff that's announcing tomorrow, actually, all the information that we've seen, all the leaks say it's not more than 4 cores. And so next year we'll get Ice Lake, are they calling it Ice Lake X or are they calling it Ice Lake LP or whatever? But anyway, that will get you up to 28 cores on Intel's 10 nanometer, but that's like 3 years behind where it was supposed to be.
Which I actually wanted to ask, Jared, you covered Intel's gaming graphics card coming out next year, the XE-HPG. Any thoughts on how that might compare to NVIDIA's launch?
Well, so I'll freely admit I was wrong on what Nvidia would get on the shader core counts. Like they doubled them relative to what I was expecting. They went from, I was thinking your 3090 was going to be around 5,000 to 6,000 cores or shaders. They're not really cores, but shaders, and it's 10,000. I'm like, okay, so Intel, I was kind of expecting them to do maybe 4,000 cores or ALUs or whatever shader processors on their XE-HPG. Too many acronyms. I think if Intel wanted to compete with a 3090, they would have to move to basically 8,000 ALUs or shaders, or more. And we know like their XeHP, their high performance computing module for data centers and stuff, they're saying they can do 1 tile, 2 tile, 4 tile versions. The 4 tile version has 2048 execution units, and each of those has 8 ALUs, and so that's 16,000 ALUs. So like they could do that theoretically, but that's only useful for compute, because as soon as you start doing real-time graphics workloads, I don't think your tiled structure on Intel's chips is going to be useful, and I don't think XeHPG is going to do it, but we'll see. So I think Intel, like, they still have a chance, but it really depends on, are they going to go as big as Nvidia went? And we'll see. I don't expect them to, but I could be wrong.
What do you think, Matt? How do you think the XeHPG will fare in this competitive landscape?
I mean, given what I've seen from Intel in recent years, like I don't think they'll go that big either, unless there's a reason for them to do so in the enterprise space and then carry it down. Like, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me for to try to push into a market. And I mean, it makes sense from an enthusiast standpoint and people would eat it up, but again, Nvidia is not going to sell a lot of 3090s, so why would Intel try to push into that space? I think they'll start more in the mainstream. I mean, especially since they're so used to dealing with the billions, millions, billions of customers that they have in integrated graphics. They can just get something that is, substantially better than that, that's small and affordable. I think it would do well. And to put all the effort into going massive first, I would, as Jared said, it's possible, but I would be surprised.
And we do actually know XeLP stuff has been leaking and Tiger Lake. I mean, it looks like they're going to have maybe 1.6 gigahertz and 96 execution units, which ends up being somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 teraflops, which is kind of in that a GTX 1050 range. So it's respectable for integrated graphics. It's actually potentially going to be faster than AMD's Renoir integrated graphics. So, but it's still a far cry from anything that's happening at the top of the dedicated GPU space. I think Intel is about ready to kill off anything less than a $200 graphics card. I mean, obviously, if you've got an old system, you might want the $100 graphics card, but if you buy, a Tiger Lake laptop, there's not going to be any need to get it with a GTX 1650. It's no, you'd have to get at least a 1660 or maybe a 2060 before the bump in performance would warrant the extra cost.
So it looks like we have just one more question from our viewers, and I want to answer it because I know the answer to it. Do we know how much the 3060 or 3070 will cost? So the 3070 will be $499. They did not announce a 3060. Do we think we'll see one?
Eventually. This is very much like most of Nvidia's product launches. They start at the top, or at least the penultimate. So in the past, they launched the 1080. The 1080 Ti came out a year later or whatever. 2080 Ti launched simultaneously. They're doing that with this launch as well. We're getting 3090 and 3080. 3070 comes a bit later. If you looked at the 20 series launch, the 2060 came about 5 months after the initial RTX launch. That came in January, whereas the first cards, the 2080 Ti, launched in, I think, August. I'd need to double check, but so my assumption is January or February roundabouts is when we'll probably see the 3060 arrive, and we'll probably see a 3050 as well. Based on the specs they're giving, they could definitely cut down even further and be hey, here's a 3050 card that costs $200 or $250, and it will deliver better performance than a 2060.
Well, the Blunt Force is doing a build for their friends, so good luck. You're a good friend. I haven't done that for any of my friends.
Well, right. He's not buying the build, right? The guy buys the parts, and you just help him put it together. I've done that for lots of people.
That's a good point.
Actually, what was I going to... Oh, we were talking about Intel. The thing with Intel that's interesting too is Intel really likes their high average sale prices. Like they entered and then left, then re-entered the SSD market, and then they've left again. And it's like, well, what are they going to do with these graphics cards? Like XELP is not a high-end card. You can't sell it for a high-end price. But I really don't know what Intel's doing with their graphics cards. It's going to be interesting to watch.
I think you could have ended that sentence before with their graphics cards.
It's going to be a busy coming months for you, Jared.
Yep. I've got a lot of RTX 30 series cards coming soon. I haven't got any now. If you want to know, I think I can say that. Like now that we had our little live stream today, I do not have a 30 series card in the house yet. I don't have drivers for it either, but we know the launch date is September 17th and then September 24th for the 3090. So I will probably get cards a week before then and drivers 4 days before then, and it's like good luck.
And then the new driver like a day and a half before the launch.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm going to be benchmarking like a fiend over the next couple of weeks, and it's going to be down to the wire, I'm sure. And then we'll get all the third-party cards that we can and run those through the ringer as well. I'm very curious to see how the Nvidia models compare to the Asus and Gigabyte and MSI and whoever else. It's like, is their new custom cooling solution, is it better? Or is it kind of like, well, it's different, but guess what? The big fat honking triple fan cooler that Asus makes is still perfectly sufficient. I suspect that's the case.
I mean, my biggest, I don't know, not question, but kind of fear is like, what is availability actually going to be like? Because, with their major global issues going on, and there are many more people at home more often than they would be. And this seems to be like it's going to be a pretty impressive launch. So if they don't have a lot of stock, I think it's going to be pretty hard to find these cards for a while.
Oh yeah, it's going to be just like the past launches where it's like, even if the prices are super high, which $1,500 is astronomical, there probably aren't going to be more than, I don't know, thousands, tens of thousands worldwide. And I think there's enough people out there that will want to buy that can afford to buy it, that they'll still sell out, and they'll keep selling out for at least the first month or two.
Well, so lots and lots to keep our eyes on.
So if you really want a 3070 or 3080 or whatever it is, and you're willing to take the chance and pre-order, like that's your best chance of getting one without paying, the price gouging fees. But I don't know. I'd probably just wait and see what Big Navi does as well at this point. It's only a month or two away. Is it that big of a rush? Maybe it is for some people.
Well, what if you need your 8K now?
Yeah.
8K.
Already have the TV waiting, all three of you.
Well, it looks like that is about all the time we have for today, but there's still plenty of news on our site, of course, including news on the new graphics cards, as well as other announcements NVIDIA made today. So definitely check that out to learn everything you need to know about Ampere as well. In case you're wondering, we will be back this Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern for a regular Tom's Hardware show. So you can hang out with us again this week. We'll be getting into more news from the week and hanging out with a special overclocking guest. So stay tuned for that. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel or like us on Facebook. And you can also download every episode of the Tom's Hardware Show as a podcast. How convenient. So that is it for now. Huge thank you to Jared and Matt. And we will see you again this Thursday.